Sure.
For another.
We're right now to.
Okay, let's set it up.
Yeah. It's moving on.
What do we?
Yeah, we're through December. Oh, good. But we don't have anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, 30%.
Yeah.
I'm on board.
Okay, good. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's like a great idea.
Yeah.
We just had that century. Yeah. Send it out. What's that? The neighbors look at that. Which one do you want? Yeah.
Now it's good for you. They're gonna end up that. Late.
It's that way. Thank you. So.
Yeah.
They have a different.
Good afternoon. I'm Doug Petty. I'm your host for today. And, typically, as a Twin Research Group, we have a monthly session, and we always start out with people introducing themselves. We like people to network. It's a networking opportunity just to know what other people are doing. And so, if you wouldn't mind, we could just go around the room and you can just say who you are and maybe where you work, what your interests are, tell a joke or whatever, and we'll get around the room real quick. We can start here with Ela.
I'm Ela Rausch. I'm a project manager in the Community Development Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And one of the things we're working on right now is consumer credit conditions, which you'll hear about in a little bit. I've also been working on a number of activities related to the Federal Reserve's Healthy Communities Initiative, which is a broad initiative focused on trying to bring together the health sector and the community development sector to address social determinants of health in neighborhoods.
I'm Michael Williams. I'm a financial analyst in the Community Development Department at the Minneapolis Fed. And this is a lot of what I've been working on over the last 3 or 4 months or so. Say more.
I'm Ed Cashmark. I used to be an economist at Wells Fargo, and now I'm looking for a new opportunity.
I'm Hyla Mays, the long-range plan for the city of Minneapolis. Lisa Hirschberger. I work for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency on air quality issues and air policy, and we've been getting involved in trying to understand the source of wood smoke, residential wood burning, and so I've been involved in surveys on that and trying to learn more about that methodology.
I'm Shelby McCoy. I'm a fiscal analyst for the Tax Committee of the Senate. Formerly, my doctorate was in geophysical sciences, atmospheric science, so my interest is diverse. I'm Whitney Morton. I am in Department of Tax Research at the Minnesota Department of Revenue.
You get great at the section.
My name is Callie. I work with Prepare and Prosper, formerly Accountability in Minnesota. We offer the tax preparation and financial services. And I'm leading Minnesota's first volunteer-based financial coaching program. We wanted to expand that. And you said a joke. My mom is a first grade teacher. Her favorite joke to tell her kids is, why was 6 scared of 7? Because 7, 8, 9. That's a great joke.
My name is Corinne. I'm also from Prepare and Prosper. I'm the financial inclusion campaign manager. And my job is to manage a new initiative called the FAIR initiative, which is the financial access and inclusion roadmap. And that's focusing on working with leaders in the practice as well as financial institutions and NGOs to build a financial product. And
I'm Peter Matheson. I am a research associate with the Minnesota Compass Project here at Wilder Research.
my name is Robin Beal, and I'm with the Neighborhood House in St. Paul, as a youth education provider for immigrants and underserved.
I'm Jeff Benson with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and I'm the coordinator of the Community Geographic Information System.
Neil Young, I'm the Economic Analysis Director at SCU, Minnesota Economic Development. Just mentioned one interesting project that we're working on right now. We've hired, at the legislature's request, consultants to study the economic effect of North Dakota oil on Minnesota. So that will be coming out statutorily February 15th, so we'll hope to videos come out about that date.
My name is Lex America. I'm an analyst with Steve in the Economic Analysis Unit. I guess right now energy's hot, so we've been working on a clean energy report that was released last week that looks at the size, scope, and the composition of clean energy employment in the state. And now I'm starting on a pipeline project with a couple other agencies.
Hi guys, I'm Tom Keane. I'm with the Ramsey County Management Office. Currently, I'm working on a lot of economic prosperity initiatives, and been a lot of work with Ramsey County to try and increase economic prosperity for all our citizens through community development.
My name is Steph Bell. I work with the Minnesota Homeownership Center, and I work with the HUD Housing Counseling Program there, but today I'm actually here in my capacity as an intern for the Minnesota Homeownership Center to learn more about
Díaz from Wilder Research and the in-house economics. We specialize in cost-benefit analysis. Daily we'll be doing for child education, addiction programs for the NAS, for the North Youth Fund. We are part of the one.
I'm Allison Macy. I'm a researcher on the Minnesota Compass Project.
And Jay Todd, I'm a college and development study on
Sarah Heimel. I'm statistician with the U.S. Census Bureau. Actually, working on the ACS Mechanism Survey. If you have questions, also modifying, I'm happy to see questions.
And I'm Doug Petty. I'm a bureaucrat with Ramsey County. But we're really excited to have two people from the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis who will be presenting on consumer credit conditions. That's why you're here. Just real quickly, Hila Rausch is the project manager in that department in community development, and Michael is a financial analyst and data analyst. And with that, I'll just leave it up to them. I will say that Hila at one time was on our programming committee, and was when I used to work here at Wilder, we worked together. So fun time. So go ahead, take a seat.
Compass alum for all of the
and they
Compass
said that
people in
you
the
can
room.
interrupt them with questions as they go along. Just might mean don't be too long.
Our colleagues in the back of the room, what they didn't mention is they are our assistant vice president and vice president, so all of the hard questions can go to them. Before we start this presentation, I must say that the opinions expressed are those of the presenters and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System. Before we get into the data, I did want to tell you a little bit about community development within the Federal Reserve System. I know a number of people in the room have had an opportunity to work as our partner very closely, and they know what we do. But for those of you who don't know, the Community Development Department is actually a function within the Federal Reserve System. Each of the 12 reserve banks has a Community Development Department. And very broadly, we're charged with serving low to moderate income communities. And so it's our job to promote credit access and economic opportunity in LMI neighborhoods and areas. And so that's something unique that you maybe didn't know about us. We do this through data analysis, research, information sharing, which we're doing today, and we also do a number of trainings and convenings around topics that impact economic well-being in LMI neighborhoods.
Sorry, quick question. What is LMI?
Low to moderate income. I should mention that not all of our work is strictly LMI. Oftentimes we are charged with gathering information about community development issues that impact Main Street. And so the data that you'll see today actually is for all income levels in the Twin Cities. We do have a pretty big presence on the web. So if you'd like to follow us on Twitter, our handle is Minneapolis.CMD. And we also just recently launched a brand new webpage called fedcommunities.org, which actually aggregates reports, information, studies, activities from all of the Federal Reserve community development departments across the system, all in one place. So that's an opportunity to get connected and see what the Federal Reserve is doing with respect to housing and employment and consumer credit conditions and some of the issues that we work on frequently. So now into the data set. The information that we're presenting today actually comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Consumer Credit Panel. And this data set is a partnership between them and the Equifax Credit Bureau. This data set was put together right around the time of the financial crisis, where folks decided that they needed to have better information about consumer credit conditions across our nation. And so this partnership formed. So it's actually proprietary data that we get from Equifax. So unfortunately, it's not available to the public, but we're excited to be able to share some of our findings with you today. The data set is based on a 5% random sample that is drawn based on the last digits of Social Security numbers. They pull in everybody whose Social Security number ends in 13579, and they redraw the sample quarterly. And so the sample actually mirrors very much what we would see in the normal population. So as immigrants become U.S. citizens and establish a credit file, they would enter into the sample if their Social Security number matches that, and as people pass away, they would also exit the sample because they would no longer have a Social Security number. The data set in doing that is representative of all, I should say, U.S. citizens with a credit file. So not just U.S. residents, but all U.S. citizens with a credit file. And we're able to get account level information from Q1 1999 to the present. So I should tell you that we don't actually get to see people's names, and we don't actually get to see their Social Security numbers. That's how the sample is drawn. So there is a level of anonymity there, and it is scrambled. One of the unique and exciting things about this data set that I should mention is that it does allow us to follow households over time. So the data set will pull in all of those people that have that Social Security number, and then they pull in everybody in their household. And so if you end up as one of the primary in the data set, it will pull in anyone in your household who also has a credit file. So that could be your spouse. If you're living with roommates and your roommates have credit files, they will come into the data set too. Or if you have teenagers, then perhaps you've granted your teenager as a authorized user on your credit card, they will come into the sample as well. So that is unique in that it allows us to sort of look at new households that are forming and also what's happening with households over time. To get a sense of what's actually in the data set, it includes individual level information for mortgage and home equity loans, auto loans, student loans, bank cards and credit cards, retail loans. So for example, if you have a Target card or a Nordstrom card, that would show up there. And then other personal loans. So if you took out a loan from the credit union, for example, that would show up in that category as well. You know, thinking about some of the things that we can look at with respect to these loans, we can look at the number of loans. We can look at the amount of loans, and we can also look at the repayment status, so whether or not they're delinquent or are being paid on time. Also in the data file, we can look at credit scores, so FICO scores. We have the ability to get the age of the person that's in the sample based on year of birth. And then also, because the credit files have addresses attached to them, the other geographic elements that go into the sample are state, counties, that census tract, and census block. So we can actually get this information down to a very fine level. I should mention that the data set does not include race, and it does not include income. So that's a little bit tricky when we start to think about how we can look at trends among different populations. I will say that using geography as a proxy, sometimes we can get at race and income for very homogeneous neighborhoods where, for example, on the north side, we would expect to, it's reasonable to assume based on HDS data, we know that this census tract has this level of poverty or this level in income, so we can do some matching that way. I'm not going to read these all to you, but this is just a list of recent research and policy analysis that has been done across the Federal Reserve System using the Equifax Consumer Credit Panel data to kind of give you a sense of the types of research questions and topics that are being tackled with this data. So looking at debt levels among certain populations, what impact the housing market has had on consumer debt, student loan debt, auto lending, deleveraging. And if you're not familiar with the term deleveraging, it's basically households, it's the opposite of taking on more credit. It's paying off your credit and moving into a saving mode. Today's presentation, we are going to focus on 3 attributes of consumer credit in the data set. We're going to talk a little bit about what's happening with mortgage loans, auto loans, and student loans. And then we're going to look at 3 indicators relevant to consumer credit conditions. We're going to look at debt prevalence, debt levels, and delinquency rate. So a couple of key comparisons that we focused on when we did the data analysis. We looked at how does the Minneapolis-St. Paul 13-county MSA compare with the 20 largest metros in the U.S. And then we also looked at how do different age cohorts living in the Twin Cities compare with their counterparts in other metro areas. And that was broken down into the 4 generational groups that you see there. And we were able to look at trends for the last 4 years, 2010 to 2014. Doug mentioned that instead of holding questions till the end, we're going to take them as we go. We really wanted this to be an interactive discussion, so I hope you'll ask Michael lots of questions as he presents his data and charts. But some questions to consider is you're seeing the data. 1, has subprime lending returned? That's something to think about as you're looking at these charts. 2, what is the relationship between student loan debt and home ownership? And what trends are we seeing there? And then 3, one of the things that we're most interested in is what implications do these findings have for your work and or the clients you serve? We'd be really interested in knowing how people would like to use this data. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael.
I have a lot of charts, so people that like to see charts, it's a good thing, not a lot of bullet points. So I'll start with just kind of a basic overview of how we collected the comparison groups. So the idea was to compare the Twin Cities to other MSAs throughout the country, and the first one that came to mind was just to look at the top 20 MSAs nationwide by population. So this is based on 2012 ACS data. These are 20 largest MSAs. These are the 2009 OMB definitions of MSAs. For the Twin Cities, it's the 13-county metro area rather than the new 16-county metro area. So that's what we're pulling in for kind of any ACS information, but also any information from the Consumer Credit Panel as well. I've sorted them by this calculation that I call the debt-to-income ratio. So this is not like the debt-to-income ratio you think of when you think of applying for a mortgage, but instead it's the total amount of outstanding consumer debt in each of these MSAs as it relates to the total amount of aggregate income for an MSA in one calendar year. I think this is 2012. So you can see kind of the disparity that you have from the city with the least, Houston, with about a 1-to-1 ratio, all the way down to San Diego with a 2-to-1 ratio. And obviously, I mean, the big driver for these differences is going to be home values and mortgage debt. You can see that all the California and Western cities are clustered here at the bottom, mostly Midwestern cities up at the top with the exception of New York, which I think probably has relatively low home ownership rates, and as a result, relatively low debt-to-income ratio. See, by this simple statistic, it's Minneapolis, St. Paul, MSA Brooklyn in the middle. So not the least amount of aggregate debt and not the least, or the most. I won't be breaking out trends for every single one of these MSAs. As I explained when I get into some other charts, there'll be some pooling that goes on. But I'll try to also highlight when we look at different indicators, both the extremes on like the higher and the lower ends as far as the prevalence of debt by debt type. This is another way of just kind of quickly summarizing what credit conditions are like in the Twin Cities relative to the other large MSAs. So it's just a distribution or a density distribution of the Equifax risk score. The Equifax risk score is very similar to the FICO risk score that you hear about. I think the range is the same. It goes from a low of 350 to a high of 850. Obviously, the higher risk scores are the least likely to default on debt. I think the technical way they rank it is your risk score indicates the likelihood of delinquency, serious delinquency within the next 2 years. So obviously, if you look on the far left-hand side, there aren't actually people with risk scores at or around 0, but that just represents that there are these things called thin files within credit bureau reporting, and these are individuals that don't have sufficient information in their credit file to generate risk scores. So the red Minneapolis, you can see, is shifted way to the right. We tend to have pretty good high risk scores. I think from other sources you see that if you look at like a mean or a median risk score, we tend to be at or very near the top, not just among large MSAs, but like every MSA. We're usually in the top 5. We also have a relatively low number of thin files, which is kind of another indication that we have a lot of people that have relatively good credit. I intended to pull in some information from the ACS to kind of make some of these points, but these are some things to keep in mind when you see kind of where the Twin Cities stands in terms of aggregate debt amounts or debt prevalency or delinquency rate. So first of all, we have a relatively older population in comparison to some of these other large MSAs. Older populations tend to have higher risk scores because when you're young, starting off, you don't have a lot of credit history, and you start off pretty low. And as you age, you build that credit risk score. We also obviously have a very high home ownership rate. I don't think it's the highest out of these 20 MSAs, but it's close, suggesting that we're going to see a fairly high prevalence of mortgage debt in Twin Cities. We had among the top 20 MSAs, I think we actually have the highest level of autos per capita, which kind of surprised me. But I think it's something in the range of 0.75 cars per person in the Twin Cities. Maybe you think with something like that, we're also going to have a high prevalence of auto debt. And then, as most of you probably know, we have a large share of educated people, a lot of people with at least some post-secondary education, and with that, probably likely a lot of people with some student loan debt. So you're going to see a lot of slides that look a lot like this, for better or worse. I'll just, on this first one, explain how they're kind of formatted. The solid black line is always going to be the Twin Cities. It's time series over time. It starts back about 2000 and goes through the second quarter of this year. When there are other outlier MSAs, they're going to be the finely dotted lines. So in this case, this is the share of individuals with mortgage debt. You can see that Miami has the smallest share of individuals with the mortgage debt. And then everyone else, other than putting 20 lines in every chart, I pooled into one, and you kind of get the average number for the remainder of the large MSAs. So as you can see, it's pretty much across every MSA. The share of individuals with mortgages is declining, not surprising. We're off our peak from 2008. I think we're up well into about 42% with the mortgage, down to about 37% as of the most recent quarter. That's kind of part of what's the story behind the deleveraging process that Eva talked about. And there are two main contributors on this chart that have led it to that deleveraging. The one big one, obviously, being the foreclosure crisis and the drop in home values and the loss of home ownership that started right around 2008. Another big contributor has been, another one that's been widely reported in the press, and that's the decline in first-time home buyers. So those two factors, even though you're seeing a few people going into foreclosure, you're still seeing this trend continue downward. It's not just the Twin Cities trend, though. It's a national trend. And if you do compare the Twin Cities by, say, generation groups, you find that millennials still have the highest rates of shares of individuals with mortgage debt, so also probably the highest home ownership rate. Gen X is the same, also ranked #1, and baby boomers also have the highest. If you get up into like the greatest generation group, that changes quite a bit. We dropped to about 8th, which I think is probably a good sign, because you're moving from people that have into a generation that's mostly paying off their loans and they own their homes free and clear. So I guess the story with this slide is following national trends, but still, tops among the share of individuals with mortgage debt. So moving through, we're going to move through kind of, the prevalency charts first. And you see that there's an entirely different pattern for student loans, where mortgages kind of peaked in 2008 and have been tapering off ever since. The share of individuals with student loans in all MSAs has been climbing very steadily. I think the New York Fed did a study that said from about 2004 to 2012, it's seen about a 70% increase nationwide in the share of individuals in student loan debt. And, the Twin Cities follow that pattern pretty closely. These dips here kind of in 2007 or so, I think, are probably data anomalies, so I wouldn't worry too much about what you're seeing there.
This might have something to do with the previous slide.
It might, and yeah, I have a few slides following that may get into that, but I think there's some evidence that there's some impact that's happening there, and I'll get to that a little bit later. This one's a little bit more interesting. I mean, it's a little bit more obvious too when you break it out in terms of generation. So the Twin Cities here, we're at what, 23–24% of people with a credit file have some student loan debt. If you look at millennials, that number's all the way up to 57%, which is kind of higher than I've seen based on some other data sources. Gen Xers are at about 27% of Gen Xers have some student loan debt, and about 14% of boomers. 57% of millennials. Another interesting that we find when we cut this by income tract levels, so pulling in ACS information about income tract, median family income, and merging that in with our tract level information from the consumer credit panel. Unlike any other debt, and this probably makes some intuitive sense if you think about it a little bit, low income tracts tend to have the highest prevalence of student loan debt. High income tracts the lowest. It's the only debt type where that's the case. Otherwise, all the other debt types are kind of inverted. And then, so for the other debt types that we're going to cover, the percent with auto debt. In some sense, I think this is the most interesting slide in these first three series. You see the Twin Cities has about 30% of individuals with an auto loan debt as of the most recent quarter, according to 2014. If you go back to 2011, that was about when we troughed. That level was about 26%. And the one thing that really jumps off on this chart is the divergence that we see from kind of the typical MSA line. So, so this dashed green line again is the pooled MSA experience. We tracked it very closely. In fact, the Twin Cities were ranked either 12th or 13th from about 2000 all the way to 2011. We were 12th or 13th. And since 2011, our ranking, we've moved past Tampa, we've moved past San Diego, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Detroit, Riverside, Phoenix, and Baltimore. So we've gone from the 12th ranking in the share of individuals with auto loan debt all the way up to the 4th. And it looks like if that trend continues next quarter, we're going to pass St. Louis and have the third highest share of auto loan debt. And I think, at least in my opinion, that seems like that's a good sign. It looks like maybe it's a sign of some economic growth and good economic conditions that we're seeing in the Twin Cities. And it's happening everywhere. Most MSAs are actually rising on this scale, but we're doing so at a much quicker level. Maybe a sign of kind of a return of consumer confidence, maybe a lender confidence. I don't know how you disentangle those two. A little bit more with auto loans. So with the resurgence in auto lending, you have seen some more news coverage about the resurgence in subprime lending. This seems to be the debt type where that there seems to be the most truth to that. You've seen, I think, certain lenders dipping back into subprime lending for homes and other debt types, but in auto loans, we're able to see, this is the total amount of originations in dollar amounts over time. You see that we kind of peaked just before the housing crisis excuse me, really hit, and then had a steep decline, so there was a lot, like a pullback in financing durables. And since about 2010, you've seen a, excuse me, a resurgence both in prime and subprime lending. And what we mean here by subprime, it's anyone that had a credit score of less than 660 at the time of origination is included in that lower dotted line. Everyone else is in the solid one above. One thing you can see is that it's been not just an even increase in both, but it looks like prime lenders are actually the ones that are driving the bulk of the return to auto lending. Okay, so this is back to the other chart format, but on a different indicator. So this is the average debt. So the previous slides kind of show you that the Twin Cities, we have a high prevalence. We have a lot of people that have these types of debt. Maybe some better news when you go into the average debt levels. The Twin Cities, at least for autos, we're at the very bottom. So we have a lot of people with auto loans, but on average, they're fairly low. There's not a whole lot of variation that you see within generations. Millennials or Gen Xers tend to rank 19th or 20th, so it all washes out to about 20th for the MSA as a whole. And you can see, though, that the average debt level would kind of track the same kind of pattern, that prevalence, that the share of individuals with that chart showed in the previous slide. I just think it's kind of interesting for the outliers on some of these loans, on auto loans. You know, Houston was kind of, in aggregate, the least leveraged city, but by far in auto lending, both in prevalence and in auto debt, have had some of the highest rates. So the mortgage debt slide, again, not a lot of jockeying going on within generations, but you can see kind of where we stand in relation to other large MSAs. This is, again, really heavily driven by the difference in property values. San Francisco has some extremely high values. And I should mention that when we're talking about mortgage debt, this is not like the average mortgage loan. This is the average mortgage debt per borrower, per individual. So a lot of mortgages have two borrowers on them, right? So you can't exactly double that number, but the typical mortgage is probably going to be considerably higher than $250,000 in San Francisco. So you had, obviously, the run-up in mortgage levels until about 2006, and that's kind of flatlined. So the thing to take away, I guess, as far as this is going back to the track income level information, within the Twin Cities, you've had a relatively level balance of mortgage loans since 2006 for most tracked income levels, except for low-income tracts. Low-income tracts is one place where you've seen a sharp decline in the average level of mortgages. Again, likely related to the foreclosure crisis, where you had this big buildup in newly mortgaged individuals, and then the foreclosures hitting, and then a lot of mortgages coming back off the books, and the average mortgage levels declining fairly rapidly. I don't have a chart for that, unfortunately, here. So average student loan debt. Again, we're back to the lowest out of the 20 MSAs. You can see, I mean, similar to the student loan prevalence, you can see that there's been this sharp increase in average student loan debt from really pretty low levels. I mean, back at 2000, we're talking, these are all nominal dollars, by the way, $9,000, and pretty much straight line increases across MSAs up to over $20,000 for the Minneapolis MSA as of the second quarter of 2014. One thing I'm trying to figure out about this, if you break this chart down by generation, we rank 20th overall as an MSA. But when you look at millennials, our ranking goes up to 15th. So our millennials tend to have, I mean, it's not on the excessive side of student loan debt, but we tend to have relatively higher levels of student loan debt than the MSA as a whole. And it's true for Gen Xers too. They're a little bit lower. They're ranked 16th. I think what's happening with that is our baby boomers actually have fairly prevalent amounts of student loan debt, but also pretty low levels of student loan debt. So that seems to be what's balancing out and pulling the MSA as a whole down on the chart that you're seeing.
It'd be interesting to see this chart adjusted for inflation.
Yeah, and that occurred to me. That occurred to me. I wanted to do that, but kind of ran out of time because unfortunately, everything that we do when we put together this consumer credit panel data, we have to run it by Equifax before we can publicly present it.
Oh, really?
And that was like exactly one of the things for most of these charts. I thought, I really should just index this inflation, and didn't have the time. Yeah, Neil? We can't really see that. I mean, I think that would be my intuition, that the way that works. And I should also say that when we're looking at individual loans, we're not looking at the legal liability that a person has. So if you take out a student loan and you have a co-signer, the entire amount of that student loan shows up on both of your credit reports. The way that we're adjusting it is we're looking at kind of the overlap, what's the joint amount, and we're dividing it evenly among those two borrowers. Yeah.
Are you looking at undergraduate or people on the commercial?
This is everyone in the population. So this is a different, I think, I'm trying to remember how some student loan statistics look. I think they look at like a graduation cohort. So they'll start at, I think the most recent one I saw is 2011 graduates. They graduate with X number of debt. Then after 3 years, they come back and see what percentage of that cohort has delinquency. And I think by, or not delinquency, defaulted. And I think by default I mean 270 days. So with those kinds of rates, I think you're seeing that default rates have started to decline. But no, this is the entire population, anyone with student loan debt. They don't even have to be a student in order to have a student loan debt in this chart. And finally, a slide that is not a chart. So I was putting together these slides, and I came across this article. It was run in the Star Tribune, originally in the LA Times. And the headline was this college debt curbed home sales by $83 billion. So this is getting back to kind of what's that interaction between rising student loans, rising prevalency, rising average student loan amount, and the decrease in home purchasing. And unfortunately, when I read the article, they didn't really lay out what the methodology was for the study that well, or at least that I could understand. It was done by a home builder consulting firm, and kind of a back-of-the-envelope kind of calculation to see to find that there was this $83 billion hit to home sales. But later in the article, this kind of jumped out at me, is that they referenced this Federal Reserve Bank of New York study that found that young people with student debt are now less likely to hold a mortgage than people who had never attended college. And I looked back through some of the studies that I've seen. It seemed like something that was based off of the Consumer Credit Panel. A lot of the research that's been done in the Consumer Credit Panel comes out of New York, and I don't think that's right. So if you've seen any kind of stat like this, I don't think that's the right interpretation. And I'll show you kind of the chart that they use that I think was basically misinterpreted for that article. This is back to prevalence of mortgages. And here we're shrinking the universe of people that we're looking at down to 30-year-olds. And you have on the y-axis the prevalence of mortgage debt among 30-year-olds over time. So in each one of these quarters, it's the 30-year-old group. And then they split these 30-year-olds into two groups. One is a group that had a recent history of student loans. So they had a student loan payment within the last 3 years. And the other group is individuals that didn't have a recent history of student loans. So they hadn't had a student loan payment from the age of 27 to 30. So you'll see there's nothing in here about whether or not these people are college educated. I mean, you could easily have gone to college on scholarship and be in this group. You could have gone to college and had a significant amount of student loans and just paid them off before you're 27, although that seems like that's becoming less and less common.
Or you could have gone to college, got a whole lot of debt, but not graduated.
Right. Right. So what you're seeing, what used to be the case is that this top line, those that had student loan debt, that used to be a better predictor of whether or not you were going to have a mortgage until about 2008. And then you have, well, it's past 2008, but you have this steep decline in both of these groups. So you see this trend where it seems like whether or not people have student loan debt, 30-year-olds just aren't taking on mortgages in either case. But the relationship does flip. So it does look like maybe there is some evidence that, on the margins, that student loans are pushing some people out of taking on mortgage debt, out of home ownership. And I think if we post these slides, I'd link to kind of a blog post that they wrote to briefly summarize this research. But I think it was pretty interesting finding. So I have like one last series, and I think in some ways this is the most interesting series of charts, getting out of average debt levels, prevalence of debt, to getting into delinquency rates. And where's the Twin Cities at in terms of delinquency rates? So you can see, well, first of all, you can see that Miami had a lot harder go of it than the Twin Cities did. In 2010, actually 20% of people with mortgages were delinquent on their mortgage. And they're still working their way down. They're still over 10% as of just this last quarter. The Twin Cities sort of have been tracking kind of the pooled MSAs. We didn't rise quite as high. I mean, a lot of these larger MSAs were kind of in the sand states and in the West Coast. And we were relatively low. I think as of the most important, we ranked 17th for the share of people with delinquent mortgages. This is the share of people that have a mortgage. And it's delinquent. We were recently overtaken by San Francisco. I think a lot of that has to do with property values. Probably hard. They're booming right now, so it's a lot harder to have a delinquent mortgage in that environment. So a couple breakups, again, going back to the kind of generational pieces. This isn't commonly the trend, but within the Twin Cities, it looks like millennials actually have the highest delinquency rate. In most MSAs, it's Gen Xers. And I haven't had a chance to really think about why exactly that is, but that's something that's on my to-do list to get into. Why is it that our millennials seem to stand out a little bit? And it's a relatively thin slice of people that have mortgage debt. And I think it may be related to the fact that maybe people get into the housing market a little earlier in the Twin Cities than they do in some other markets, but that's just a hunch at this point.
It could be due to higher educational attainment too. If they're getting a college degree, they're probably, well, not according to the previous chart, but generally speaking, if they're getting a college degree,
with the debt that comes
more college degrees, more home ownership. I would think that's just it.
Well, this is of people.
In Minneapolis, I mean.
Right, but this is of the people who have a mortgage. What is their delinquency rate?
Right.
So.
But I'm talking about the millennials.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Is that in the
Do you think that would lead to higher rates of delinquency among millennials, or do you think that would be an earlier rate of home ownership?
That higher one would be millennial versus Gen. Can you even get marriage out of that?
We can't. Well, we can't get. We can't certainly get marriage out of it. We can see whether there are multiple people in a household. So if that's an interesting question. So we may not be able to know whether they're married, but we might be able to get a sense based on their mortgage debt levels that they at least are joint mortgage holders, and then maybe look at that question a little bit. I hadn't thought of that. So the millennials have the high delinquency rate. The other thing, just if you slice it a little bit finer too, and you look at millennials and low and moderate income tracts, we go from the third high. Well, I should say this too: that millennials in the Twin Cities have the third highest delinquency rate of millennials in any MSA. And that's really wildly different than what you're saying for the Twin Cities as a whole. So again, that's sort of what was feeding to my theory of more people getting into the mortgage earlier at kind of the peak housing prices. And then the last piece that I'll say is if you cut it even finer down to low and moderate income tracts, that's when we're at number one. We actually, millennials and low and moderate income tracts actually have the highest delinquency rates in the country, well, in the 20 MSA sample. Caveat on that, getting sliced pretty thin. So I'm not doing the full 5% national sample. I'm down to a 1% national sample for these charts and figures. So I would like to expand the sample size a little bit to make sure that that's a fairly robust number.
That would fit a lot of our disparities. We rank badly in a number of different classes by low and moderate areas versus the rest of the region. And I almost wonder if there's a proxy in the millennials that the younger population tends to be more diverse than the older population.
And the other thing that's kind of hard to square is, I'm using, I don't know if the definition is consistent, but when I'm using the geographic definition of LMI communities, it's a relative definition, right? So it's the one I'm using is the median family income of a tract relative to the median family income of the entire MSA. So what is a low-income tract in the Twin Cities might be a considerably different set of circumstances in a low-income tract in a lower-income community or a higher-income community or one with a greater dispersity or less kind of homogeneous levels of income in the tract. So that's kind of sort of the bad news on this slide. There is some good news, I think. For one, the transition rate of mortgages from current to delinquent. So this is loans that are current going into just 30 days delinquent or worse, is back down to historical levels. So it's back down to what we were seeing back in 2000, 2001. So even though delinquency rates are still elevated, the flow into those delinquent statuses, it seems like that's stopped. So to some extent, it's kind of working through these last delinquent mortgages before we are really pretty close to a return to normal. And that holds true also for within the consumer credit panel, you get flags for whether or not there's a new foreclosure on a record, and so the prevalence of new foreclosures has dropped down to 2000 levels as well. So for the Twin Cities and actually for the nation as a whole. So some promising signs for the housing market. The percent with delinquent auto loans, I don't have a whole lot to say on this slide, but I just thought include it because I've been including all the other debt types. You can see that Minneapolis is relatively low. We're not at the lowest. Boston's the lowest. Atlanta has a lot of delinquent debt, but I think our ranking here is roughly 17th or 18th among MSAs. So this is an interesting one because this is one where millennials are less likely than Gen Xers to be delinquent on their auto loans. That's not been the case with a lot of other debt types. And then the last delinquency chart, this is really the one I kind of wanted to focus on as far as delinquency goes, back to student loans. The student loans are really the outlier here with these different debt types that you're seeing. You're seeing that with the first set of charts, the prevalence of student debt has been increasing. The average size of student debt has been increasing. The delinquency rates have been increasing. Fortunately, Minneapolis is at the low end, so that is a good sign. And when you look at delinquency rate among generations, at least on this measure, you see that delinquencies across generations, delinquency rates across generations are actually pretty similar, which was a little bit of a head scratcher for me. So, sorry, question.
Have you seen any research on the prioritization of debt types among, is there a regional effect or a generational effect? So you have auto, you have student, you have home. I assume if you have thin resources, you're going to pay one for prioritized families. Are there any differences between them?
Well, I haven't looked into that with this data, and I have to think about how I would go about doing that. I know that, for instance, with the housing crisis, that you saw a shift away from the prioritization of paying a mortgage. People started paying credit cards down and started paying auto loans, and basically let homes that were way underwater go into default rather than doing what they thought was throwing the money away. So there's some of that there. More recently, I haven't seen how that's changed, and I haven't seen that broken. I haven't gotten into how that's broken out by generation. That's really an interesting thing.
Think about like assets that people can repossess. No one can repossess your degree. So, in terms of paying off stuff.
But you also can't go bankrupt on your degree.
Right. Right.
So.
Right.
You can't.
I guess I wonder if you have different interest rates, like a car loan might be at 5%, a student loan at 9%, and a mortgage might be at 12%. Would you go, if you had saved up money to buy a car, but then you find out, well, you can get a bigger car loan, then you could move more money to pay off your higher end debt, but absorb a higher amount of car loan debt. Might that be shifting some of these numbers?
Well, okay, I can give you an example. So back before the housing bust, home equity lines of credit were rising. And the usage of HELOCs were rising quite a bit. And about 25% of the use of HELOCs was used to finance auto loans. So for that reason, because you were getting better rates on your HELOC debt than you were getting on a standard auto loan. So I think there is some shifting around. I mean, it's sort of hard to move. I mean, if you're locked into some of these kinds of debts, particularly auto loans or home loans, student loans, to kind of reprioritize, other than where you're kind of focusing the payments. Because if you go delinquent on one, you either lose the home or your paycheck gets garnished in case of student loans. So there are kind of repercussions to trying to balance those around. I mean, there may be something like people shifting certain debts on the credit cards that's happening, but I haven't looked into that with the panel data yet. The one thing I want to get to with the student loan debt, so like I said, if you break it out by generation, delinquency rates are pretty similar. This is in the Twin Cities. It range from 10 to 12%. From millennials to boomers, and that was like a head scratcher for a little bit. But there was this chart that an economist at the New York Fed did that sort of explain why that's the case. So student loans, student loans can really either be in repayment or they can be not in repayment, right? They can be in a grace period or they can be in deferment. You can be accumulating debt, student debt while you're enrolled in school. But for a standard delinquency rate calculation, you're using all of that debt in the base calculation. This was as of 2012, and he found that I think it was 44% of student loan debt actually wasn't in repayment, so it wasn't even really possible for that debt to become delinquent.
Is it forbearance?
Oh, okay. So right, left-hand side, this is not in repayment. It could be forbearance, it could be grace period, return to school, those kind of situations. The right-hand side, these two slices of the pie are the debt that is currently in repayment. So the top one is the one delinquent debt in repayment. Bottom one is current.
The red chart basically says that they're getting to repay again.
The red chart, both these slices are people that are in repayment. These are people that are in repayment, but they're not making their payment, so they're delinquent. These are people that are in repayment.
Repayment in the period.
Like they have like a monthly student loan payment. Yeah. So I looked at this for the most recent quarter, and it's about 40% of people with student loans are currently in repayment. So it looks like this segment of the pie has shrunk a little bit. Twin Cities is a little bit lower, so we have a little bit smaller share of individuals that are not in repayment. So then you basically ask yourself, what's the right way to look at, what's the right way to calculate a delinquency rate? And I would argue that it probably makes more sense to take this slice of the pie as a share of this portion of the pie, right? And if you do that, hopefully you can see these ghosted lines, but you see that most MSAs have about a 50% jump in delinquency rate. Minneapolis is still at the bottom. So it's gone from about 11% in the most recent quarter up to 16%. You look at places like Miami where they're well over 30% of student loans in repayment are in delinquency status. And this also, when you make this adjustment, this is where the generational differences start to make sense. So you have boomers, they have about 12% of their loans are currently delinquent. Gen X rises to about 16%, and millennials goes all the way up to 20%. So they go from about 12% to 19%. And I guess just one last kind of downer note. Minneapolis is the lowest, right? I mean, we have, by this calculation, about 16% of individuals that are delinquent on student loans. If you remember back to the first section of the slides, we also have the highest share of individuals with student loan debt. So we have, even though we have a low delinquency rate, we do have a relatively large number of people in the Twin Cities that are on their student loans. And
we've got about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, and I'm going to stop on this slide. This was just the, I guess this will be the summary slide. So this is everything except for mortgage debt, right? And it's just aggregate debt levels. So forget about delinquencies again. This is how aggregate debt levels in the Twin Cities have changed over time. And you can see this blue line, I believe, is the student loan one with the straight kind of growth continuing straight through the recession. Not much sign of it slowing down. You might have heard, I think, nationally, the U.S., I think student loan debt's up to about $1.1 or $1.2 trillion. And it recently surpassed credit card debt as the #1 debt outstanding, aside from mortgages. That actually happened a lot earlier in the Twin Cities. So we're kind of a student loan favoring. I mean, we obviously get a lot of good things for this. We got a lot of highly educated people. We have a lot of people that are homeowners, so we have a lot of debt. But this is a large chunk of the debt that we have here. So I guess I'll just jump to the end and open it up if there's any questions.
We could, we have the room until 1:30, so you can stay, but a lot of people need to go at 1 o'clock. So first I'd like to thank our speakers. and every month, helping us with all the tech issues and helping us get all set up, and he clears up the table. He's just been amazing, and he works with Wilder, so he's just been, but he's been here like he's just been a real anchor of these presentations. So if you would just join me in and with that, we're about 1 o'clock. So if anyone needs to leave, please just feel free to do that, and otherwise you can go ahead and ask more questions.
I was wondering if you could talk just a tiny bit about the nuts and bolts method. We're talking about individual level data, right? How many records? I mean, what's kind of the end?
This is what I wanted to get to.
What software do you use? Kind of that.
This is exactly the slide I wanted to get to. So nuts and bolts. So for the primary sample, I think it's roughly 12 to 14 million individuals per quarter. So we have, I don't know what that is, back through the beginning of 1999, we have about that many individuals per quarter. Now, when you bring in the household individuals that Ela was mentioning, that brings the N for the number of individuals up to 44 million or so per quarter. And
there's 187 variables in the data set. I know that.
Yeah. Oh, so hundreds isn't true then, but almost hundreds of variables. So it's a large data set, and it's also several tables that you have to join together in order to work with. So I don't know a whole lot about like the technology behind SQL databases, but the database that it's stored on is called a Greenplum database. It's, databases, I guess it's a derivative of Postgres databases. So it's like this, started off as this open source database that uses some of the same SQL syntax that you see with Postgres, but it's a massively parallel database, so it allows you to work with very large scale. I mean, this isn't probably what would pass as big data in Silicon Valley, but to me, this is very big data. But it allows you to do fairly intensive queries in relatively short periods of time. So the way I interact with that myself is I work in R. I don't know if there's any R users in the room. They have an IDE called RStudio, so this is an open source statistical software package. And there's some basically open source add-ons that you can use that can link up your R environment to a database. One in particular is called DeepWire that allows you to write kind of R code that you already know and understand, translates it on the fly into SQL, and then goes into the database and executes some of the analysis in database where you get this huge time savings and pulls the results back into your R session. There's actually, since you asked, and this didn't make it into a lot of the data, but there's this package called ACS. So I know there's a lot of people in the group, at least in other sessions of CCRG that I've been to, that use ACS. I think there was an ACS presentation earlier this year. There's a really cool API that Census puts out that allows you to go out and programmatically pull in information variables from the ACS. And there's a package that's been written in R to make this even easier than kind of doing that. And it's basically these 3 lines of code. The first one, all it does is load the package. So maybe this is my pitch to get people to tinker with R. There's this line that loads the package. There's a second one that defines the geography. Here I'm saying I want the geography to be the state of Minnesota based on the FIPS code and all the counties. The star is the wild card for all the counties in the state of Minnesota. And then I want to go out and fetch all that information. I want to fetch it for the 2012 5-year ACS for that geography and this particular variable. This variable is like the aggregate income for each county. And when I run that line, it returns to me aggregate incomes for every county in the Twin Cities. So then you can just turn that into an object that you merge into other data that you're working with and just like feed into this data analysis workflow that's really nice. Just a couple other, so like if you want to change it up, same thing, except I want all the cities in the state of Minneapolis, so I do place rather than county. Change up the variable, same year, and then I have, I think I'm looking at populations for each city in Minnesota. And then the last one, this one I used for this particular presentation, it was like I pulled in all the MSAs. I pulled in, I don't have it here, but I pulled in the populations and I just ranked them based on what the population was. You can pull in multiple variables at a time, and it's just a really, really fun way to kind of churn through ACS data pretty rapidly. So I link a lot of this stuff up to at the census tract level to the data that we have in our database in order to do some of these comparisons.
So you're writing the code too in RStudio, or just?
If you like this is, I mean, you know, I don't know if I call this code or scripts or, you know, I mean, I'm not a programmer, but I've been working with R for like, you know, 6 or 7 years now, so I have a pretty good sense. I'm not a statistician, I'm more kind of a generalist, so it took me a while to learn how to do this. But, you know, on top of just these data manipulation things, you can do some pretty sophisticated statistical analysis as well, easily, because it's open source and other people have already written the code for you. You just got to kind of figure out how it works and then run with it.
With that, I just mentioned that in December, our December session, the second Wednesday of the month, Todd Graham will be talking about ACS and applicable uses of ACS data. While we're at it, November the 12th, our presentation will be by 2 people from the Graham County Department of Corrections talking about an evaluation of criminal justice data, looking at ways to improve outcomes for offenders in
Did you get a chance to see the report this morning about student loan delinquency rates going down?
I did, and I think that was that calculation based on that cohort approach.
Yeah, and how they actually changed the calculation.
Yeah.
They changed not only the cohort approach, but also what loans they include in the delinquent basket, if you will.
Yeah, so I think you're going to see, you'll probably see more of that, at least this is my hunch, you're going to see more delinquency rates that are calculated that way decreasing. But that's kind of a survival, like you're only looking at it in a 3-year outlook, right?
Right.
So if you keep extending it and you factor in all these other people that have debt outstanding that are going to eventually probably have delinquencies, you probably still, on this other kind of approach of calculating delinquency rates, see a little bit of a continued increase.
Yeah.
But I mean, that is definitely promising.
Yeah, but it's a little bit of a break because if you go back further in time, if you use a 2-year cohort, it's going to be higher, versus the 3-year cohort, it's going to be a little lower because you're including a lower number in the 3-year cohort. So it's actually a little bit misleading in the sense that before you were looking at 2-year cohorts all the way when it's going up, but now you're looking at 3-year cohorts, so it makes it look like it's going down, when in actuality it may not be.
Because they define them.
Because they included a lower number in the cohort.
Oh, okay.
So just kind of.
That just came out today?
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't see that one.
Yeah.
Didn't like
I just saw it on Yahoo Finance.
Okay.
I have a question for people here. I'm kind of interested in knowing, for those of you who you know, are sort of concerned with the economic well-being of households or of communities, how do you think about consumer credit, and how does that factor into some of the work you're doing, or how might you think about it as you think about kind of all of the different dimensions that you know, use to think about community conditions? Does this kind of shed light on anything for you, or change your thinking in any way?
I think that last chart was really quite eye-opening with the student loans. It's going straight to the moon, like you said, with no end in sight. I mean, that's going to be a problem, and it already is, as you can see with fewer people buying homes because they can't pay off their student loans. That's just one observation that I've made.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen not really hard data on it, but there seems to be more initiatives in place to try to get, you know, young people applying to college to consider, you know, what the expected return on their investment in you know, the student loans that they're taking out. You know, I think it's the BLS. Someone's putting together kind of a website that gives you a sense of, based on this degree at this particular institution, you know, what is the projected range of outcomes for starting salaries and that kind of thing. And I think as long as there's more of that.
Saw that in The Economist.
Yeah.
Article about that.
Yeah. So hopefully, I think that's a good thing, and hopefully there's more development along those lines.
But I'm wondering if we're going to ultimately end up having like a HARP or a HAMP for student loans, so people can, renegotiate either the loan rates or the loan amounts or the loan term or whatever. Because I mean, you're looking at, like you said, 100 or 1.2 trillion.
10 years in debt. And then
True.
certain jobs, you get a certain amount of degrees.
Right.
The public service.
So you're already at parts of it.
And the 10%, where the 10% for 10% of income.
Yeah, I think that was the executive order. I don't know, is that actually going to happen like in next year where everyone that has income-based repayment would?
I think it starts, does it start next year?
You never know what's going to happen. Congress and people moving in and out.
Right.
I'm going to take a second stab at your question. As to based on the clients they work with, we're all kind of trying to work with the vendor. I'm going to get the approval. We're kind of working on what we can cut, release publicly that would be useful. So based on the organization, the client, what kind of information of this type we cut or provide that might be used for
The town plan, we the area that is considered one of the best towns here. I can say on a personal reason, one out in one area, they want to come to the same city, want to purchase a wall. It's on the parents' stuff with high mortgages that we and in our area, because we live in population, the average age of there is like 37. There's somebody who probably houses to. Well, won't be in the next week. I guess what I'm trying to say is it would be nice to see more folks from the rural areas coming into the cities and that and how that affects the rural areas.
Is there data like this for rural? Because you kept mentioning that on a phase right now.
We've got county data that's been we get from various groups out there.
Yeah, as far as the consumer credit, it's nationally representative. I mean, so we have every tract in the country.
So people who are plotted in like rural Minnesota get considered part of MSP in this report?
No, so it's a 13-county metro.
So we pulled in everybody who lives in.
We could have done other.
We could have done an analysis based on rural, but we didn't.
Exactly. We look at Indian reservations too, which are largely rural as well.
This is part of that data set, but when you were talking about it, you just pulled it with the metro.
Yeah.
Okay.
We just decided to put it on the metro.
So flip side comment on the rural planning. I'm a city planner for Minneapolis, and we're seeing that the real estate trends there is all the construction is in apartments, and they tend to be in very transit-oriented areas. And it's really fascinating to think about this. I think a lot of the discussions about, the millennials are choosing to live differently than past generations. They're choosing not to buy a house. They're choosing maybe not to buy a car. They're choosing to live in more urban, higher density, walkable areas. And part of this big question is how much of that is people choosing a different lifestyle, and how much of it is reflecting financial realities. And it doesn't really even matter if they're different. I mean, and in terms of the effects, but ultimately, if these underlying financial realities change, people's preferences change, or have we really made a generation that likes to live differently than previous generations? So I don't know. It's not this can't answer the full thing, but it's very interesting to think about watching those trends track, because it's extremely clear in the real estate market where the growth is happening, and it's all in those places.
Yeah, and I actually thought a little bit about the transit-oriented development piece.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I wish, like, even if rather than high rent apartments, if everyone was moving into the same locations but actually buying condos, then we would have a really great data source for that kind of thing. But unfortunately, we don't, because we're not catching the rent. So I don't know that.
But you could take there are rent vacancy rates, and rates are somewhat. I mean, they're larger geography, but I wonder if somehow. Right, it is hard though. I mean, even the realtors, they have all kinds of great ownership and great kinds of rental. Like,
right.
is there some way to get loan qualification information out of it? How many people actually would qualify for a home?
Yeah, we didn't have a slide on that. So there are other things other than balances and delinquency rates. We can get payment amount. We can get inquiries. So we can see whether there's been basically a hard inquiry pull on your credit file. But we can't really link these things up. So, I mean, we could probably proxy for some of that, but
Proxy for application.
right.
But we do see the credit score in terms of just the raw ability.
We have to score.
That doesn't mean that it's not.
You know, you're asking about like applications for this. For Preparing Proctor, we serve 13,000 taxpayers across the country this year. And the average, I forget if it's median or mean, but it's 516 is the credit.
Oh, okay.
I'm not statistician, I'm nervous about using words here. But you guys are all number nerds in a different way than we're number nerds. But anyway, a lot of our taxpayers that we serve have substantially low credit scores, and there's many that are very thin file, so they don't have anything, like they're close to that zero, like you're saying. And so it's interesting to see, you know, the trends in many of our taxpayers say that they don't have that, they get declined quite often, so if they want to, you know, improve their credit, they know that that credit affects many parts of their life, and they're wanting to make strides forward. But there aren't products necessarily that are designed, you know, for this market. So that's largely what the is wanting to work on, is to find pathways for people to move, you know, along that way. But we do work with that population that's largely the lower end. And then we mentioned largely the disparities of race and
yeah, and that's one thing I'll bet to.
It's much different than that red population that's really shining to look at.
Yeah, before I started looking at this data, I knew that it wasn't like a normal distribution of credit scores, but I didn't realize, at least, especially in the Twin Cities, how much it does shift over to the right there. The 560 is a fairly small number of people that are at that level or below.
The opportunities are just so huge. You know, because we work with taxes, we're trying to come up with a model that can work for a secured credit card using their tax refund, so people would save part of their refund into a savings account, but that would still probably be there, and you guys probably know about these things. But then they would be able to use that as a credit line. So there's no risk to the institution because the money is already in their account, so their limit would be limited to what was already secured in their account, but they would still support that credit lending to the credit bureaus, and so hopefully over time that would allow them to move forward and report to the bureaus, because a lot of people are shut out. This is not approved for anything really. From what we hear anecdotally, I don't have this data.
Well, and some of the, I mean, some more aren't rental outcomes and rents and some other things that aren't necessarily related to debt levels working their ways into some of the major credit bureaus' files. Yeah, we don't have access to them, but
yeah, there's some housing figures but yeah, there's some places with rentals where they're wanting to report that as time as payments or rental payments made at the time to report that. But even though not all rentals report it, it's still used as screen. So when you go, you want to live at an apartment, they can still pull your credit report. Even though that they're after a period of payment time, it doesn't report back, you know, for future. So credit is a huge barrier for not daily basis, but many large decisions that they want to make in their life is Harvard. So anyway, this is important to hear. It's good to hear kind of the trends of that.
Did it graph over time?
no, but I don't think it actually shifts all that much.
Okay.
Because credit scores tend to be more of a relative ranking than they are kind of your absolute likelihood of defaulting. So if you have a 750 credit score in 2000 versus a 750 credit score in 2006, that 750 credit score in 2006 has a much likelier chance of having a delinquency based on kind of the exogenous economic conditions that are happening at the time.
It might be worth noting we do have some of these statistics for the federal Bank of the district. We do something specific like this on the web page.
Oh, we do have a credit score.
We do have a credit
at
And we
our
have the
current
extension
commission.
of the population growth. And both of those time to zero. That's where it is.
Whatever I did,
Are you reporting at an area that's smaller than an MSA that's available to the public? Or is it really all aggregated at the MSA level?
We want to have that. There is some precedent of county level reporting, not necessarily over time, I think, but some of the other Federal Reserve banks have done some cuts at county level. In a perfect world, we go lower than that, but it's something we have to work on. Thank you.
Thanks.
So you made all the starts with R?
Yeah.
Really?
You use R?
A little bit. I took an online course learning R and some of the ggplot and some of the charting and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Quite honestly, I mean, the way that they were showing us how to do it, I really wasn't all that impressed.